Nobody remembered who started the empty circle. It just existed, for tables in every direction around the human girl, always vacant, always clean, like some invisible wall kept the rest of the cafeteria away from her. Rena Wilder sat in the middle of that silence every single day, eating her meals with the calm focus of someone who had long stopped expecting company. The cafeteria on Station Orena 12 was loud. Mirati diplomats argued in their wet, clicking language. Gorvathi soldiers laughed in deep rumbles that rattled the drink dispensers. Sorcerer medical cadets whispered nervously in their corners. Dozens of species filled the hall with noise and color and life. And then there was Rena, alone, quiet, chewing. She had been on the station for 3 months. The Galactic Cooperative had accepted humanity barely a year ago, and Rena was one of the first humans assigned to a diplomatic post. Cultural liaison, they called her. Everyone on the station knew what it really meant. She was a token, a checkbox, something the cooperative could point to and say, look, we included the Deathworlders. Nobody expected her to stay. Tovin certainly did not. The young Mirati attaché walked past her table that afternoon, with 4 of his colleagues trailing behind him like pale, four-armed shadows. He was tall for a Mirati, which meant he stood about a level with Rena. Though his frame was thin and amphibian where hers was dense, with muscle and bone forged under a gravity these species could barely imagine that he bumped her tray. Not accidentally. His hip caught the edge and sent her meal sliding across the table, scattering grain paste and protein strips onto the surface. The cafeteria went quiet. Tovin looked down at her and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that Deathworlders really should eat on the floor with the rest of the animals. His friends laughed. A few tables away, other species watched with expressions ranging from pity to amusement to carefully blank nothing. Rena did not look up. She reached in her pocket, pulled out a small cloth, and wiped the table clean. She gathered the spilled food onto her tray, set it aside, and continued eating what remained with steady hands and a face that showed absolutely nothing. Tovin waited for a reaction. A flinch, a word, anything. He got silence. After a moment, he scoffed and walked away, and the cafeteria noise slowly returned like water, filling a hole dug up on the observation balcony above the cafeteria. Counselor Draith watched the entire scene. The senior Mirati diplomat was older than Tovin, smoother, with pale blue skin that had faded to near white with age. He held the datapad against his chest and observed the human girl with the clinical interest of someone watching a lab specimen behave. As predicted, he dictated a quiet note into his personal log. The human experiment continues. Subject shows expected passivity. Estimated time to transfer request. 3 weeks, perhaps less. He turned and walked away without a second look. Later that afternoon, a small voice interrupted Rena in the corridor outside the medical wing. Excuse me. Rena turned. A sorcerer stood behind her, barely reaching Rena's chest. She had soft brown fur, enormous dark eyes, and her small hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles showed through the F. You are My name is Yulin, the sorcerer said. I am a medical cadet. I have been reading about your world, about Earth. Rena studied her for a moment. Most species avoided her. The ones who did not usually wanted something or wanted a gawk. Yulin swallowed nervously and asked if it was true that humans could survive with only one lung. Rena blinked. Then, for the first time in what felt like weeks, she smiled. A small one. Barely there. Yes, she said. It is true. Yulin's enormous eyes went even wider as she launched into a stream of questions about human biology that Rena answered with quiet patience as they walked together down the corridor. It was the longest conversation Rena had held on the station since arriving. That night, alone in her quarters, Rena exercised. Push-ups, pull-ups on a bar she had welded to the ceiling frame herself. Stretches that would have torn the joints of half the species on this station. The gravity here was set to 0.7 of Earth standard, comfortable for most species aboard. To Rena, it felt like moving through a dream. Every step was too light. Every jump carried her too far. She had to think about being gentle constantly, with doors, with furniture, with people. She finished her routine and stood at the viewport. Stars filled the darkness in every direction, thick and bright and endless. Somewhere out there, impossibly far away, a blue planet spun through the void. A planet where the gravity crushed, where the air burned, where the water drowned, where the animals killed, where the weather destroyed, and where a species rose from the dirt anyway and learned to build fires and tell stories and love each other despite all of it. Rena pressed her fingers against the cold glass. Not yet, she whispered. She did not say what she was waiting for. She did not need to. The stars did not ask, and the station did not care, and Rena Wilder went to sleep in the silence she had carried with her across the galaxy, heavy as gravity, quiet as stone. The alarm did not scream. It sang, a low, pulsing tone that climbed through the walls of Station Orena. 12 like something alive, and by the time most people understood what it meant, the lower corridor of Deck 9 was already filling with pale green gas, coolant line rupture. The words scrolled across every display on the station in 6 languages. Toxic chemical exposure. Evacuate sections 9 through 12 immediately. Bodies moved. Mirati sprinted on long legs, their 4 arms pulling smaller species along. Gorvathi soldiers sealed their faceplates and barked orders. Sorcerer cadets, small and fragile and terrified, scrambled for the upper levels with their fur standing on end. Rena was on Deck 9 when the pipe burst. She had been walking back from the maintenance bay, where she sometimes helped recalibrate the station's gravity plating. The work was simple for someone raised in full Earth gravity, and nobody else volunteered for it. She heard the rupture before the alarm, a sharp hiss followed by the wet smell of something chemical and wrong. She pulled her shirt collar over her nose and moved toward the emergency exits. The gas was already ankle-deep and rising, a heavy vapor that crawled along the floor like a living thing. Around her, aliens ran. Some stumbled, some fell, and were dragged up by others. The corridor was chaos. Then she saw Yulin. The small sorcerer was on the floor near a ventilation shaft, curled on her side, her fur darkened with condensation from the gas. Her chest moved in tiny, shallow jerks. The sorcerer respiratory system was delicate, built for clean mountain air on a world with almost no industrial pollution. This gas was killing her in seconds. Rena did not think. Thinking was slow. Thinking was for creatures who had not spent 200,000 years evolving on a planet that tried to kill them every single day. She tore a strip from her uniform sleeve, poured water from her canteen over it, and pressed the wet cloth over Yulin's nose and mouth. Then she picked the sorcerer up like a child, tucked her against her chest, and ran. The medical bay was 200 meters away. The gas was chest-high now, thick and burning. Rena's eyes watered. Her skin stung. Each breath felt like swallowing fire, even through the cloth she had pressed against her own face. She ran anyway. She ran the way her ancestors had run, not with the explosive speed of a predator, but with the grinding, relentless forward motion of something that simply refused to stop. Her legs pumped under gravity that felt like nothing to her. Her arms held Yulin tight against the poisoned air. Her lungs burned, and she let them burn, and she kept going. She hit the medical bay doors at full speed, slammed the emergency seal behind her, and laid Yulin on the nearest treatment table. The medics stared at her. Rena stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard, her arms covered in chemical burns that had already begun to blister. Her eyes were red and swollen. A thin line of blood ran from her nose. She looked at the nearest medic and said, very calmly, that Yulin needed oxygen. The medics rushed to work. One of them tried to treat Rena's arms, but she waved him off and sat down on a bench by the wall, watching Yulin's vitals on the overhead monitor until the numbers stabilized and the small Sureshi's breathing deepened into something steady point 3 decks above. Commander Braille sat in the security office and watched the footage. He played it once at normal speed. Then again. Then a third time, slowed to quarter speed. He watched the human girl sprint through gas that was rated lethal to all known species within 4 minutes of sustained exposure. She had been in it for nearly 7 minutes. She had been carrying another person. She had been running faster than any species on this station could move unburdened. Braille was Gorvathi. His people were soldiers. They understood strength and speed and endurance the way poets understood words. He had served 40 years in the cooperative military and had seen every species in the galaxy perform under pressure. He had never seen anything like this. He opened the cooperative species database and pulled up the file on Earth. He read for a long time. He read about the gravity, twice what most civilized worlds maintained. He read about the atmosphere, a volatile mix of oxygen and nitrogen that would corrode metal over decades. He read about the predators, the diseases, the natural disasters, the ice ages, the extinction events. He read the last line of the summary 3 times. Humans are classified as persistence predators. They do not outrun prey. They follow it at moderate speed until the prey collapses from exhaustion. Some hunts lasted days. Braille closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The light from a monitor caught the heavy scales of his face, and for a moment he looked very old on the lower decks. Tovin told anyone who would listen that the gas was not really that dangerous, and the human had simply gotten lucky in his quarters. Drafe added a second entry to his personal log. It was shorter than the first. She did not hesitate, he wrote. That is interesting that in the medical bay. Yulin opened her eyes and found Rena sitting beside her, arms wrapped in white bandages, reading something on her datapad. The Sureshi's voice was barely a whisper when she said thank you. Rena looked up and gave her that small, barely there smile. I'm glad you're okay, she said. Do you want some water? Tovin called it a cultural exchange. He said the words with a smile that had too many teeth in it, standing at the center of the station gymnasium with his arms spread wide and an audience of over 60 aliens arranged on the viewing benches above. Everyone was invited. Everyone understood what it actually was. 2 weeks had passed since the gas leak. 2 weeks since Rena carried Yulin through a corridor that should have killed them both. The story had traveled fast through the station, growing and shrinking with each retelling, and now half the species on Arena 12 did not know what to think about the quiet human girl who ate alone in the cafeteria. Tovin intended to settle the question. The gymnasium was a wide, open space with adjustable gravity, plating, and equipment designed for a dozen different species. Tovin had arranged a series of physical demonstrations, each one performed by a representative of a different species. A Gorvathi soldier went first, gripping a pressure machine with his massive scaled hands and squeezing until the display showed a number that drew murmurs from the crowd. A Palani swimmer performed an aquatic speed trial in the station's pool, cutting through the water like a silver blade. A Drini climber scaled a vertical wall using all 6 limbs, reaching the top in under 8 seconds. The crowd cheered for each one. Tovin narrated with the polished ease of someone who had practiced this performance many times. Then he turned to Rena. She stood near the back wall in her standard station uniform, arms at her sides, face showing nothing. Yulin sat in the front row of the benches, watching with her enormous dark eyes full of worry. Tovin suggested, loudly and pleasantly, that perhaps their human colleague would like to try the Gorvathi grip test. Just for fun, just to see. The Gorvathi soldier who had gone first looked at Rena with an expression that was hard to read through his heavy scales. He stepped aside from the machine. Rena walked forward. The gymnasium went quiet. She placed her hands on the grips, adjusted her stance the way someone adjusts to a task they have done 1,000 times before, and squeezed. The display climbed. It passed the scores of every non-Gorvathi species who had tested that day. It kept climbing. It entered the range of trained Gorvathi soldiers, beings twice her size with muscles built on a heavy gravity world of their OWIT stopped in the lower middle range of Gorvathi military scores. Nobody spoke. Rena released the grips and stepped back. Her hands were not even shaking. Tovin's smile had frozen on his face. He recovered quickly, laughing off the result, suggesting that grip strength was a crude measure and that perhaps something more meaningful would be appropriate. He proposed an endurance test. A weighted bar held overhead. Last one standing wins. Several species volunteered. A Gorvathi cadet. 2 Miridi guards who wanted to defend their species' honor. A Drini who seemed to view the whole thing as entertainment. And Rena, who simply picked up a bar and raised it above her head without being asked twice. The weight was standardized to each species' body ratio. Fair and even, Tovin announced, though his voice had lost some of its smoothness. 5 minutes passed. The Drini dropped out, laughing and rubbing his upper arms. 10 minutes. The two Mirati guards lowered their bars, breathing hard, their pale skin flushed dark blue with effort. 15 minutes. The Gorvathi cadet set his bar down with a grunt of respect and sat on the floor. 20 minutes. Only Commander Braille and Rena remained. The gymnasium was completely silent. Every eye in the room moved between the massive Gorvathi soldier and the human woman half his size, both holding their bars overhead, both still, both breathing in controlled rhythms that spoke of training and discipline and something deeper than either. 30 minutes, 30-5, T 40 minutes. Braille's arms began to tremble. A fine vibration that ran through his scaled forearms and into his shoulders. He held for another 30 seconds, then lowered the bar with a slow, deliberate motion, set it on the ground, and stepped back. Rena kept holding. 45 minutes. 50. At 52 minutes, she lowered the bar. Not because she dropped it, not because her arms failed. She set it down the same way Braille had, slowly and with control, and then she walked out of the gymnasium without saying a word. She was sweating. Her arms shook slightly once she was in the corridor and out of sight. But she walked straight and steady and did not stop until she reached her quarters. That night, Yulin came to her door. Rena let her in, and they sat together on the narrow bed while Yulin asked, in a voice filled with genuine confusion, how any of that was possible. Rena explained it simply. Humans were endurance predators. On Earth, they did not outrun their prey. They were not the fastest or the strongest creatures on their world. Instead, they followed. They walked and jogged and tracked their prey across open plains under a burning sun for hours, sometimes for entire days, until the animal they were chasing simply collapsed from exhaustion. That IT was not about strength, Rena said. It was about refusing to stop. Yulin stared at her for a long moment and then whispered that it was horrifying. Rena laughed. It was a quiet, genuine sound, and Yulin realized it was the first time she had ever heard the human laugh that I know. Rena said it on the observation deck that night. Braille found her standing alone at the viewport. He stood beside her in silence for several minutes, two figures framed against the stars. Then, very quietly, he said he had read about Earth. He wanted her to know that he understood what she was. Rena looked at him. What am I? She asked. Braille did not smile. Gorvathi faces were not built for it. But something in his deep-set eyes softened. Patient, he said. The most patient thing in this galaxy. Rena turned back to the stars and said nothing, and the silence between them was comfortable for the first time. The bruise on Yulin's arm was shaped like 4 fingers. Mirati fingers. Long, thin, and cruel against the Sureshi's brown fur. Rena saw it when Yulin came to her quarters that evening, and for 3 full seconds, something in the room changed. The air did not actually get heavier. The temperature did not actually drop. But Yulin, standing in the doorway with tears welling in her enormous dark eyes, felt something shift in the human woman sitting on the bed, and some deep, ancient part of her brain told her to be very, very still. Then Rena blinked and the feeling passed, and she was just Rena again, quiet and steady and kind. Tell me what happened, she said. Yulin told her. Tovin had cornered her in a service corridor near the medical wing. He told her that her friendship with the Deathworlder was going to end her career. He told her that the Mirati delegation was watching, and that anyone who associated with the human would be remembered when assignments were handed out. Then he grabbed her arm, hard enough to make her cry out, and told her to think carefully about her choices. Rena listened to all of it without moving. When Yulin finished, Rena stood up and gently examined the bruise. She asked Yulin if she had reported it. Yulin shook her head. Who would she report it to? The Mirati ran the station's political structure. Councillor Draith had made it clear from the beginning whose side the administration was on. Rena told Yulin to go to the medical bay and have the bruise documented. Officially, on record. Yulin looked frightened but nodded and left. The next morning, Rena went to Draith's office. She stood before the senior counselor's desk in her clean uniform and stated, calmly and formally, that she was filing a complaint against Tovin for the physical assault of a medical cadet. Draith barely looked up from his datapad. He told her that Mirati internal affairs were not a human's concern. He told her that the cadet was probably exaggerating. He told her, with a thin smile, to know her place. Rena stood there for a moment longer. Then she turned and left without another word. She went to Braille next. The Gorvathi commander listened carefully, his heavy jaw set, his dark eyes serious. When she finished, he let out a long breath and told her the truth. He believed her. He had seen what Tovin was. But station politics were layered and fragile, and the new Mirati trade delegation that had arrived last week had brought private security with them. Moving against Tovin now would create a diplomatic incident that could set back human integration in the cooperative by years. He told Rena, carefully and with genuine concern in his rough voice, that he hoped she would not do anything rash. Rena looked at him. Her face was calm. Her eyes were calm. Everything about her was perfectly, completely calm. She said nothing and walked away. The corridor on Deck 6 was poorly lit. That was the first thing Commander Braille noticed when he reviewed the security footage later. The second thing he noticed was how deliberate the setup was. Tovin and 3 Mirati private security guards entered from the East Junction. Rena entered from the west, walking back from the maintenance bay like she did every evening. They met in the middle dot on the footage. Tovin stepped forward and told Rena that this had gone on long enough. He said the station did not need her kind. He said she was leaving tonight, one way or another. The 3 guards fanned out behind him, and one of them produced a restraint tool designed for transporting uncooperative detainees. Rena stopped walking. She stood still in the center of the corridor, her arms at her sides. She did not speak. She did not raise her hands. She looked at Tovin and then at each of the 3 guards, one by one, with an expression that Braille would later describe as assessment. Tovin gave the order. The guards moved. They were trained. They were fast by Mirati standards. They closed the distance in coordinated formation, 2 from the flanks and 1 from behind. What happened next lasted 11 seconds. Braille timed it. Rena moved like water, finding cracks in stone. She stepped into the first guard's reach instead of away from it, caught his outstretched arm, and used his own momentum to fold his elbow backward until the joint made a sound the audio sensors picked up clearly. He screamed and fell. She spun. The second guard swung the restraint tool at her head. She ducked beneath it with a speed that blurred on the camera, drove her palm into his ribs, and felt 3 of them give way under the impact. He folded and dropped. The third guard hesitated. That was his mistake. Rena closed the gap in 2 steps and pinned him to the wall by his throat. Not crushing, not choking, just holding him there with one hand while his feet kicked uselessly above the floor. Tovin had not moved. He stood frozen, mouth open, for arms hanging limp at his sides. Rena released the third guard and turned to face him. She moved without hurry, without rage, without anything at all on her face. She reached out, gripped his right shoulder, and pulled it from its socket with a single, precise rotation. Tovin screamed. A high, wet sound that echoed down the empty corridor. Rena stepped back. She stood perfectly still while 4 bodies writhed on the floor around her. The whole corridor smelled like fear and copper and something chemical that the Mirati excreted when they were in pain. She looked up at the security camera, directly at it. Her face was calm. Her breathing was barely elevated. Her eyes held nothing but silence in the security office. Braille paused the footage on that face and sat in his chair without moving for a very long time. In his quarters, Draith watched the same footage. His hands trembled as he set down his datapad. For the first time in 3 months, his expression was not contempt or amusement or cold satisfaction. It was fear. His log entry that night was a single line. What have we brought aboard this station? Ambassador Helm walked like someone who expected corridors to widen for her, and they did. She arrived on Station Arena, 12 aboard a Mirati diplomatic cruiser with a staff of 12 and a reputation that made Counselor Draith stand straight at the moment he saw her step through the airlock. She was old. The oldest Mirati Rena had ever seen, with skin so pale it was nearly translucent and eyes like polished black stones set deep in a narrow face. She did not shout. She did not smile. She entered the station, listened to Draith's summary of events for exactly 4 minutes, and then told him to schedule formal hearings beginning the next morning. The station held its breath. Rena sat in protective custody on Deck 3. Commander Braille had placed her there immediately after the corridor incident. Officially, it was for her own safety. Unofficially, as Braille told her through the door with his rough, honest voice, it was because 3 Mirati trade delegates were demanding her head, and he did not trust himself to stop them without creating a bigger mess. Rena sat on the cot in her holding room and waited. She was good at waiting. The hearings took place in the station's central assembly chamber, a curved room with tiered seating and a speaker's floor at the center. Ambassador Helen presided from a raised platform, her black eyes moving slowly across each witness like searchlights sweeping a dark sea. Tovin testified first. His right arm was in a medical sling, and his face was tight with pain and fury. He told the assembly that he and his colleagues had been walking through Deck 6 when the human attacked them without warning or provocation. He described Rena as unstable, violent, and proof that Deathworld species could not be trusted in civilized society. The 3 guards testified next. Their stories matched Tovin's perfectly. Too perfectly, Braille thought from his seat in the second tier. Rehearsed, Draith spoke after them. He was composed, measured, and devastating. He presented a narrative that stretched back months. The human had been difficult from the beginning, he said. Antisocial, resistant to integration. The gas leak incident had inflated her ego. The gymnasium demonstration was a deliberate display of aggression, disguised as participation. And now, this unprovoked attack proved what he had warned about from the start. Humans did not belong in the cooperative. The chamber murmured its agreement. The political weight in the room tilted heavily toward the Mirati. Then Helm called Rena. She walked to the speaker's floor in her station uniform, hands at her sides, face showing nothing. She stood before the most powerful Mirati diplomat in the sector and answered every question with the same flat, simple honesty she used for everything else. Yes, she had struck them. No, it was not unprovoked. Yes, she was aware of the consequences. Helm studied her for a long moment and asked if she regretted her actions. Rena paused. The chamber was silent. I regret that it was necessary. She said that Helm's expression did not change, but something flickered behind those black eyes. She called the next witness. Yulin walked to the speaker's floor on trembling legs. The small sorcerer looked like she might collapse from fear, but she stood in front of the assembly and spoke in a voice that shook but did not break. She rolled up her sleeve and showed the bruise on her arm. She described the corridor confrontation. She described 3 months of harassment directed at anyone who showed the human kindness. When she finished, something remarkable happened. Other voices rose that a Pelani lab technician stood and described being mocked by Mirati staff for sharing a lunch table with Rena. A Drenni engineer recounted being passed over for a maintenance assignment after helping Rena calibrate gravity plating. A Gorvathi cadet said Tovin had told him directly that anyone who trained with a human would be reported to the Mirati delegation point one by one. They stood. Small voices from small positions, species who had watched and said nothing for months because they were afraid. Now, with Helm watching, they spoke. Braille was the last to testify. He brought security footage. Not just a corridor fight, but everything. 3 months of recorded incidents. Tovin spilling Rena's food in the cafeteria. Tovin grabbing Yulin's arm. Draith dismissing Rena's formal complaint with a wave of his hand. And the corridor ambush itself, shown from start to finish, clearly showing 4 armed individuals surrounding a single unarmed woman. Helen watched it all without expression. When the footage ended, she sat in silence for 30 seconds. The chamber did not dare to breathe. Then she spoke. She addressed Draith directly. You cornered a Deathworlder, she said. You threatened her companion. You assaulted her when she sought peaceful resolution through proper channels. And now you stand before me and claim to be the victims. Draith opened his mouth to respond. Helen raised one hand, and he went silent. She asked him to explain, if humans were so violent, why this particular human endured 3 months of sustained abuse without a single aggressive act. Why she filed a formal complaint instead of retaliating. Why the only violence occurred when 4 armed individuals trapped her in an isolated corridor with no witnesses. Draith had no answer. The ruling came that afternoon. Tovin was stripped of his position and barred from diplomatic service. The three guards were reassigned to a mining outpost on the far edge of Mirati space. Draith received a formal censure on his permanent record, the diplomatic equivalent of a career death sentence. Rena was cleared of all charges under the Cooperative's self-defense statutes. Helm added a personal note to the official ruling. It read, "The human showed more restraint than this station deserved." That night, Rena sat on the observation deck. Braille found her there, as he always did, staring at stars that did not care about politics or hearings or the small dramas of small beings. He stood beside her and after a long silence asked what she would have done if the hearing had gone the other way. Rena did not answer for a very long time. The stars turned slowly beyond the viewport. Somewhere deep in the station, systems hummed and people slept and the galaxy continued its ancient, indifferent spinning. "You do not want to know," she said quietly. Braille nodded once, slowly, and they watched the darkness together without another word. The table was full on a Tuesday morning, and Rena did not know when that had started. Yulin sat to her left, stirring something warm and purple in a cup and talking about a paper she was writing on cross-species emergency medicine. Across from her, two young Gorvathi cadets named Chorus and Dolly were arguing about whether human push-ups or Gorvathi ground presses were the superior exercise. A Pelani linguist named Finn had pulled up a chair at the end and was quietly mouthing English words to himself from a datapad, while stealing glances at Rena to check his pronunciation. 3 months had passed since the hearing. The empty circle around Rena's cafeteria table had filled in so gradually that nobody could point to the exact day it happened. 1 chair became 2. 2 became 4. Now, most mornings, she had to arrive early if she wanted 5 minutes of quiet before the small crowd gathered. She did not mind. She would never say it out loud, but she did not mind at all. The station had changed. Not in the way that storms change landscapes, sudden and dramatic and obvious. It changed the way rivers change stone, slowly, steadily, through the patient pressure of something that simply refused to stop. Commander Braille had submitted a formal report to the Cooperative's military council. Rena found out about it secondhand, from Yulin, who had heard it from a Gorvathi medic, who had read a summary on the internal board. The report argued for a complete reassessment of how the Cooperative classified Deathworld species. Braille's central point was simple. Deathworlders were not more dangerous than other species. They were more resilient. And resilience, he wrote, is not a threat to civilization. It is the foundation of it. The report was still under review. These things moved slowly. But the fact that a decorated Gorvathi commander had written it all sent ripples through channels that Rena would never see. Yulin had finished her medical training. She graduated second in her class and received a special commendation for her testimony at the hearing. The station administration, under new management, created a position that had never existed before: cross-species emergency responder. Yulin was the first to hold the title. She wore it with a pride that made her stand a little taller, her fur a little sleeker, her enormous dark eyes a little brighter. She told Rena, one evening over shared tea, that she would not have the job if Rena had not carried her through that corridor. Rena told her that she would have the job regardless, because she was brilliant and brave and too stubborn to quit. Yulin laughed and said she had learned stubbornness from a human. Draith was gone, transferred quietly to a minor administrative post on a station so far from anything important that it did not even have a proper name, just a number. His replacement arrived 3 weeks later. Her name was Sala, and she was young for a Mirati counselor, barely older than Tovin had been, with the same pale skin and 4 arms, but none of the cruelty. On her first day, Sala walked directly to Rena's table in the cafeteria, introduced herself, and extended one of her lower hands in the human fashion. Rena shook it gently. She always shook hands gently with other species. She had learned that lesson on her second day aboard the station, when a friendly handshake with a Pelani trader had left his fingers bruised for a week. "Welcome to the station," Rena said. "You will like it here." Sala smiled nervously and said she hoped so. The biggest change came on a Thursday. A transport ship docked at Bay 4 and 3 humans stepped off. 2 women and a man, all in their 20s, all wearing the same standard-issue cooperative uniforms that Rena had worn on her first day. They were wide-eyed and nervous, and so obviously knew that every species in the docking bay could see it. Rena met them at the airlock. She did not give a speech. She did not offer warnings or advice or a list of species to avoid and customs to follow. She looked at their young, uncertain faces, and she remembered standing in this same bay 3 months ago, alone, with nothing but silence and a patience that her homeworld had carved into her bones. "It gets easier," she told them. "Give it time." Point one of them, a woman with red hair and freckled skin, asked Rena if the stories were true. About the gas leak, about the gymnasium, about the corridor. Rena studied her for a moment and said that stories had a way of growing in the telling. She suggested they get lunch and see the station for themselves. The last evening began like most of Rena's evenings began. She stood on the observation deck, alone with the stars, her hands resting on the railing that separated her from the cold glass viewport. Behind her, the station hummed. Life support cycled air that a dozen species could breathe. Gravity plating held the floor steady at 0.7 G. Voices murmured in corridors and cafeterias and offices, dozens of languages blending into a single sound that was not quite music and not quite noise, but something in between. The sound of people trying. Rena thought about the title they had given her in whispered conversations she was not supposed to hear. The Deathworld Girl. She thought about what that meant. She thought about Earth, about the weight of its gravity and the sharpness of its air and the million ways it tried to kill everything that lived on its surface. She thought about the fact that her species had survived all of it and then looked up at the stars and said, "That is not enough. We want those too." She thought about the empty circle that was not empty anymore. They had mocked her. They had tested her patience, her body, her will. They had pushed and pushed and pushed until she pushed back. And in that single, terrible 11-second moment, they had understood something that 3 months of silence could not teach them. Her quiet was not weakness. Her stillness was not surrender. Every moment of silence she had carried on this station was a choice. Every insult she absorbed, every meal she cleaned up, every night she spent alone was not because she could not fight. It was because she believed, with everything her Deathworld heart could hold, that peace was worth the cost, and the graves she left behind were not bodies. They were the graves of old ideas. The assumption that quiet meant weak. The belief that different meant lesser. The comfortable lie that the galaxy could be understood by looking at a species file and reading the words Deathworld 7 and thinking that told you everything you needed to know. Those ideas were buried now. Buried deep, in ground that Rena Wilder had turned with nothing but patience and silence and the stubborn, relentless endurance of a creature from a world that never stopped trying to kill her. She stood at the viewport and said nothing. She had never needed words to change the world.